What if everything you knew was only part of the story?
So today, we are tracing the exact 34-kilometer stretch of ocean that caused that, and connecting it directly to the brutal sticker shock you are staring at when you fill your gas tank or buy groceries this week.
Yeah, we are looking at the cascading mechanics of this 2026 global energy chaos. Our sources really break down the massive escalation that began on February 28th between the U.S., Israel, and Iran.
And tracing how a highly localized geopolitical event basically rewrote the global economy practically overnight. But before we go any further, let me just state right up front that this deep dive is strictly neutral.
Totally. We're looking purely at the factual economic supply chain mechanics of this event.
All right, so we are not endorsing political viewpoints or analyzing the military ethics or taking sides in the conflict at all. Our job is just to isolate the signal from the noise, looking exclusively at the math of global infrastructure. So, okay, let's unpack this. Think of the global economy as this giant circulatory system. Today, we're looking at what happens when you pinch its main artery.
It's a great analogy. The geopolitical headlines are just deafening right now, obviously. But the economic reality comes down to a fundamental vulnerability in how the modern world moves its energy.
Because we've built this incredibly complex high-speed global logistics network, right?
Mhm.
But we left these massive single points of failure completely exposed.
Yeah, exactly. And let's start with the trigger point for this specific crisis, which is the closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
Right. We all know the high-level statistic here. It's roughly 20 million barrels of oil, so about 20% of the world's daily supply, flowing through that narrow waterway.
Just 34 kilometers wide, by the way.
Which is insane. But what I really want to understand is why the global market panics so violently, sending oil to a record-breaking $126 a barrel faster than, during the Gulf War or the Ukraine War.
Well, it's the bottleneck effect.
Because if you know a highway is prone to shutting down, wouldn't you just take the back roads? I mean, surely Saudi Arabia and the UAE have alternative pipelines to bypass that single waterway.
You'd think so, right? And they do have them, but those backups are largely an illusion in a crisis of this scale.
Wait, an illusion? How so?
So Saudi Arabia operates the East-West pipeline running to the Red Sea, and the UAE has the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline. And that one bypasses the strait entirely to load ships safely in the Gulf of Oman.
Okay, so they do have bypasses.
They do, but the fatal flaw is the sheer volume capacity. The strait handles 20 million barrels daily. Those alternative pipelines, even if you run them at absolute maximum pressure, they can only handle about 6.5 million barrels combined.
Oh, wow. So you physically cannot squeeze a 4-lane highway of crude oil into a single-lane dirt road. The pipeline physics just completely fail.
It fails catastrophically. The surplus oil simply sits in storage tanks, totally stranded.
Yeah.
And then algorithmic trading exacerbates the physical shortage.
Right, because computer models see the bottleneck, they calculate the massive supply drop, and trigger these automated buying sprees that send prices vertical.
Exactly. But the market panic wasn't just about the strait closing. This was a synchronized infrastructure shock.
Right. At the exact same time the waterway was blocked, Saudi Arabia suffered coordinated hits on 2 of their major offshore fields.
Which forced an immediate 20% production cut. And then Iraq followed suit shortly after by declaring force majeure.
Wait, force majeure, meaning they invoke that legal clause where they throw their hands up and tell their global buyers, this is an unforeseeable act of war. We cannot physically fulfill our delivery contracts, and we cannot be held legally liable for it.
Precisely. The oil literally stopped flowing, and the legal obligations to deliver it were severed instantly.
That is terrifying.
It is. And then on March 2nd, the scope of the crisis widened way beyond oil. Qatar's primary liquefied natural gas facility, which is literally the largest liquefaction plant on the planet, was attacked and taken completely offline.
So the backup pipelines are gridlocked, the production fields are damaged, and the legal contracts are just voided. When you suddenly remove millions of barrels of refined product and natural gas from the global system, the first thing to break isn't necessarily the commute to work.
Right. It's the ability to feed people.
Which brings us back to those restaurant closures in Mumbai.
Yeah, because India relies super heavily on liquid petroleum gas, or LPG, for cooking. And about 60% of their LPG imports pass directly through the Strait of Hormuz.
Now, the distinction between LPG and LNG always trips people up. So LPG is the decentralized cooking gas in those physical tanks, right? The ones that vanish from Indian streets.
Yep, it's essentially propane and butane, compressed into individual cylinders for millions of households, street vendors, and restaurants that aren't hooked up to a municipal gas grid.
Okay. And LNG is the supercooled natural gas used for heavy industry and power grids, which Qatar suddenly stopped producing.
Exactly. And the cascading effect of that LNG shortage was just staggering. I mean, Asian LNG prices surged 80% in a matter of days.
80%.
Yeah, and when prices spike that violently, suppliers will literally reroute their cryogenic ships mid-ocean to whoever is willing to pay the premium.
So developing nations were basically just outbid in real time.
They were, but the ripple effect hit developed nations just as hard, really exposing how thin their margins are.
Yeah, the sources highlight supermarkets in the UK, like Asda, facing empty fuel pumps simply because the rapid rerouting of global supply chains scrambled all their local delivery logistics.
And Australia had to step in with emergency economic triage. They slashed their fuel tax by 50% just to keep their logistics trucks moving and prevent supermarket shelves from going bare.
And didn't New Zealand crack open their strategic petroleum reserves? I read they released 6 days' worth of fuel just to stave off gridlock.
They did, but releasing reserves is a temporary patch. You know, a country will pump crude oil out of underground storage facilities, which are often these massive, naturally occurring subterranean salt caverns that have been hollowed out.
Right, they hold millions of barrels of crude safely.
Exactly. But you can only draw down those salt caverns for so long before they run dry. You are really just buying days, maybe weeks of normalcy.
But you know, the detail in the sources that completely reframes the timeline of this crisis isn't the fuel shortage, it's the fertilizer.
Oh, absolutely. The fertilizer issue is massive.
Because we usually think of natural gas purely as a way to generate electricity or heat homes, but it is actually the foundational ingredient for modern agriculture. So this oil crisis is essentially putting a surge pricing tag on next year's dinner plate.
Right. We are talking about the Haber-Bosch process here. This is the industrial mechanism where you take natural gas, specifically the methane, and subject it to immense heat and pressure.
To bind it with nitrogen from the air, right?
Yes, which creates ammonia, the base of synthetic fertilizer, and a massive percentage of the world's ammonia and urea exports originate in the Middle East, heavily reliant on the gas that Qatar was producing.
So if Qatar's LNG facilities are offline, the raw ingredient for global agriculture just vanishes. The energy crisis is quietly metastasizing into a food crisis.
That's exactly what's happening. Without synthetic fertilizers, crop yields just plummet. The natural nitrogen cycle of the soil cannot sustain the caloric needs of the current global population.
Wow.
So the 126 oil and that 80% surge in LNG prices mean fertilizer production is grinding to a halt, or the end product is becoming prohibitively expensive for farmers.
And farmers respond by planting fewer acres, or they just accept significantly lower yields, meaning we are baking profound food insecurity into the system well into 2027.
Exactly. The macroeconomic pain we are feeling today at the grocery store is mostly legacy inflation from supply chain issues last year.
Right. The true impact of this specific 2026 disruption won't hit the dinner plate until next year's harvest.
And the macroeconomic forecasts totally reflect this delayed catastrophe. I mean, the IMF downgraded global growth projections to 3.1%.
And their downside scenario is even worse, right? Warning that if oil stays elevated, global growth slumps to 2.5%, with inflation remaining sticky at 5.4%.
Yeah, and sticky inflation at that level means wage growth is effectively wiped out for the working class. The International Energy Agency is literally labeling this the greatest threat to global energy security in history.
But this pain is highly asymmetric across the globe.
Very much so. The divide is just brutal.
Because developing nations in the global south are being gutted since they lack the capital to outbid European nations for those rerouted LNG ships, and they lack the subterranean salt caverns to cushion their economies.
While richer nations take a severe hit, sure, but they can cut taxes and subsidize their way through the worst of it.
Right, but I really want to look at China, because they are sitting relatively insulated from all this chaos.
They are. The IMF data shows China weathering this supply shock with remarkable stability.
Because they aggressively built up strategic reserves over the last decade, quietly buying millions of barrels during market dips.
That's a part of it, but their primary defense mechanism is domestic grid insulation. Today, they operate 3 times the wind and solar capacity of the United States and India combined.
3 times, that's huge.
It is, and their domestic electric vehicle penetration means a massive segment of their commuting workforce is decoupled from the price of imported gasoline.
Okay, but I have to push back a bit on this whole China fortress narrative. You could build all the wind turbines you want, but you cannot run a massive, heavy industrial manufacturing sector like steel smelting and chemical refinement purely on intermittent solar power.
That is a very fair point.
Because the sun goes down, wind stops blowing. So how are they physically surviving the industrial hit when natural gas and oil from the Gulf get cut off?
Wait, are they just getting lucky right now, or did they actively game out this exact doomsday scenario decades ago?
They definitely gamed it out. It is a critical distinction, right? Because heavy industry undeniably relies on thermal coal and natural gas for baseload power and industrial heat.
Right.
China is surviving the industrial hit because they fundamentally rewired their supply chains to run on domestically sourced or land-linked energy.
Ah, land-linked.
Yes, they import immense volumes of coal and gas via overland pipelines from Russia and Central Asia, pipelines that physically bypass naval choke points entirely.
So they just removed the ocean from the equation?
Basically, yeah.
Oh.
Furthermore, their renewable infrastructure isn't just generating power, it is freeing up whatever fossil fuels they do have for industrial use.
Oh, I see. So every megawatt generated by a solar farm is a megawatt of coal or gas that can be redirected from a residential grid to a steel mill. Exactly. In fact, Xi Jinping was quoted during this crisis, stating their early push into renewables proved to be forward-looking. They saw the vulnerability long ago.
Because the Chinese economy relied heavily on imported oil moving through sea lanes, like the Strait of Malacca and the Strait of Hormuz, lanes that are heavily monitored by foreign navies.
Right. They recognized that dependence was a fatal strategic liability, insulated their domestic energy loop, and now they are aggressively monetizing the panic of everyone else.
Which brings us to the export data. The first quarter 2026 export data is staggering. Chinese EV exports surged 78%. Lithium battery exports are up 50%. Wind turbine components rose 45%.
The crisis created an instant, insatiable global demand for energy independence hardware. And China practically owns the manufacturing monopoly on that exact hardware.
This forced pivot is fascinating. Here's where it gets really interesting, because historically, it takes a massive trauma to alter entrenched global infrastructure.
Very true.
It's like human nature. You know, we refuse to go to the gym or change our diet until we have a minor heart attack. This crisis is the global economy's heart attack, forcing us to finally go green.
That's a really good way to put it. The historical parallel is the 1973 oil shock, which single-handedly catalyzed the first global wave of investment in fuel efficiency and nuclear energy.
And what we are seeing in 2026 is that mechanism on steroids. When oil spikes to $126 a barrel, the financial calculus flips completely.
Right. Solar, wind, and battery storage are no longer just environmental initiatives. They are aggressively, undeniably cheaper on a pure cost per megawatt basis.
The market data proves it. Global EV sales jumped 66% in March 2026 alone. People aren't buying them purely to lower their carbon footprint. They are buying them because they literally cannot afford the daily operating cost of a combustion engine vehicle.
And those slow-moving government policies are suddenly moving at warp speed.
Like the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States and the Critical Raw Materials Act in the European Union.
Exactly. The policy frameworks existed, but this crisis validated them as urgent national security protocols.
Because the realization across Western defense departments is that anchoring your entire industrial base to a 34-kilometer stretch of water halfway across the world is just an unacceptable vulnerability.
Yes. National security arguments are now achieving what decades of climate reports could not. Relying on a single waterway is a fatal design flaw.
So the defense departments are doing the heavy lifting for the green transition. But as much as we can theorize about the renewable energy landscape of 2030, we have to deal with the chaos on the ground today.
We do. We are recording this deep dive in late April 2026, and the geopolitical status is a bizarre, highly dangerous limbo.
The timeline over the past few weeks is dizzying. On April 8th, a ceasefire was supposedly announced. On April 17th, Iran indicated the Strait of Hormuz would reopen for commercial vessels.
But immediately after, former President Trump, reflecting the maintained U.S. posture, stated the U.S. naval blockade on Iranian ports would remain in full effect.
And in direct response to that ongoing blockade, Iran slammed the strait shut again on April 18th. So how can we even call it a ceasefire if the naval blockades and the choke point closures are still happening?
You really can't.
The bullets may have stopped, but the economic warfare hasn't.
I completely agree. The pause in actual missiles gives a false sense of security, making this the most precarious phase of the conflict.
Right, because the International Energy Agency released a somewhat optimistic forecast suggesting crude flows might normalize by mid-2026.
But the physical reality of the infrastructure damage and the political gridlock completely contradict that optimism. The disruption is prolonged.
And we go back to the fertilizer problem. A mid-2026 normalization is too late. We are currently in the middle of the crucial spring planting season for the Northern Hemisphere.
Exactly. A farmer cannot wait until July to apply nitrogen.
Right, if they don't get the fertilizer in the ground right now, the crop fails.
And you highlighted salt caverns earlier for oil reserves. The fundamental terror of the agricultural supply chain is that there are no salt caverns for fertilizer.
Wait, really? None at all.
None. There are no massive, multi-month strategic reserves of ammonia sitting underground. The agricultural sector operates on a strict just-in-time delivery model.
So the global food supply has absolutely no shock absorbers built into it.
Zero. And historical data clearly links sudden spikes in basic caloric costs to severe social and political upheaval.
Because when people cannot afford bread or rice, governments fall.
Exactly. The longer the strait remains closed and fertilizer is restricted, the higher the mathematical probability of profound instability radiating outward, particularly from the developing world.
We have spent the last few decades optimizing global logistics for maximum efficiency. Just-in-time shipping, single-source manufacturing. We made everything incredibly cheap and incredibly fast, but we sacrificed all of our resilience. The whole system is balanced on a knife edge.
Efficiency is the enemy of resilience. We removed all the expensive redundancies from the global supply chain, operating under the totally flawed assumption that the primary arteries of global trade would remain perpetually open.
So for you listening to this, the sources we analyzed offer some stark, practical takeaways. First, filter out the political noise in the headlines and watch the underlying supply mechanics.
Yeah, specifically look at fertilizer exports over the next 2 months as an indicator of next year's grocery bill.
Second, audit your own exposure to these global shocks. If you rely heavily on fossil fuels for your commute or your home heating, you are tethered to the volatility of distant geographic choke points.
Prepare your personal budget for agricultural inflation, too. The cost of food over the next 18 months will reflect the cost of the energy crisis happening today.
And critically, recognize the weight of the policies your local and national representatives are supporting right now. Are they building localized resilience, or are they maintaining dependence on vulnerable global arteries? Check the show notes for the direct data sources and IMF reports we pulled from today to explore the mechanics yourself.
It's all about staying informed and thinking critically.
Exactly. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final thought. We just saw how a single 34-kilometer stretch of saltwater can bring the global economy to its knees. But as we aggressively push into this new era of technological forced evolution, as we build millions of electric vehicles, rely on localized smart grids, and import thousands of tons of lithium, cobalt, and rare earth metals, it makes you wonder, what new, invisible choke points are we quietly building into our future economy without even realizing it? 10 years from now, will the next global heart attack be a blocked mineral strait in the Pacific or a targeted cyber attack on a centralized digital power grid?
We are rewiring the entire global economy. The question is whether we are eliminating the vulnerabilities or simply changing their addresses.
The system always has a main artery. We better figure out where the new ones are before they get pinched. Until next time.